We have tonight, our agenda is 2 workshops, and the first one is Bonnie Wetter, who is going to be giving us a workshop on Robert's Rules of Order. And Bonnie, I want to thank you for being here tonight and for offering to do this for us. Our policy is that we run our meetings according to Robert's Rules of Order, but it's not an easy thing to learn. So we appreciate you bringing your expertise and helping us out tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I thought maybe I'd just start out a little bit in telling you who I am. I'm not sure everyone knows me, but I have a Beloit address for the last 47 years. I'll warn you now, I do not live in Beloit. I live in Newark Township. But I've been formerly with the BMO Harris Bank. I worked for 38 years and have been retired for almost 3 years now. And as most bankers, we do get asked to belong to a lot of boards. And one of the boards that I was asked to belong to was the Badger Council of Girl Scouts. And if you've never seen a formalized Girl Scout board meeting, you don't know what Robert's Rules of Order is. I went to my first national meeting about 35 years ago, and it was in Detroit, and it got me so enthusiastic about Robert's Rules of Order that I've been kind of a pain to most people who run a meeting with regards to it, because it really does talk about an orderly meeting. And it had young girls who were participating in the Robert's Rules of Order process, and it just was a fantastic experience. So first of all, I need to tell you a disclaimer: I'm not a registered parliamentarian. I am a parliamentarian enthusiast. I have no intentions of talking about your bylaws. You have legal counsel for that. So we're going to talk about and give you food for thought for running a successful meeting and to be able to go through the thinking process with regards to Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order was started by Brigadier General Robert, and he went to a church meeting in 1874. So Robert's Rules of Order has been around for 142 years. And it started with 16 pages, and today we have 669 pages. And I just thought I would tell you how many additions and changes. And you can see there isn't that many. There's been just 11. And from 10 to 11, most of those changes had to do with electronic meetings and tallying. So those have been well thought out. And now, can I ask, how many have read 669 pages of Robert's Rules of Order? Good for you. It was a thrilling evening, wasn't it, when you read that? I will also just mention to you that if you have an interest in looking at some questions with regards to Robert's Rules of Order, they have their own website, and it is robertsrule.com. And you can go in there and see the most commonly asked questions, and you can, there's an association, and they will answer at no charge. They'll try to sell you a book, but they will answer your questions, because someone else has probably already asked it, and they will be able to refer to it. Why Robert's Rules of Order? Well, it's a very good way to learn obedience, self-control, courtesy, patience, and making a meaningful meeting. Because it really goes and it hits every possible opportunity that a meeting can bring out. There are rules of procedure. When you have a meeting, there is a published notice. There is a published agenda. And that is your roadmap for organization. Now, when you have a published agenda, it goes out, whatever your bylaws say, 5 to 10 days in advance. And in doing so, something may have come up that you might want to add on to that agenda. When you start your meeting and it's called to order, you should have the opportunity to add or delete any item on the agenda by making a motion to do that. And when you do that, that also needs a second, and that also needs a majority vote. A meeting of the assembly is all members are equal. One vote, one person. One thing is discussed at a time. You can have a single motion that has some subsidiaries motions inside of it, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You have full discussion before any action. This discussion can also be called debate. You have propositions to talk about rather than people. You have propositions that may yield to privilege. And privilege is, you may want a clarification on something, you may not understand a subject, and you can ask for a motion of privilege. No discussion for interruptions. No discussion for suspensions. No second time in the same form at same meeting. So what does that mean? If you have a motion that you have made and it has gone before the assembly, you can talk about your motion and you can discuss the pros and cons of it, but you cannot discuss it again until all people who have not spoken about the motion has talked. And then you only can talk one more time. So on a specific motion, you can talk twice. Majority decides, and you notice I say da, usually. Sometimes there is a requirement that it be a 2/3 vote. And silence gives consent, but not a yes vote. If you decide not to vote, if you abstain from a vote, that's a no vote. So one of the things also that is important is your agenda, because that is your roadmap. And minutes are important. And I hope that everyone takes the time to review your minutes in detail so that next time that you meet and you comes up and say, does everyone approve of the minutes? You can make corrections or clarifications. And in doing so, the minutes then from that previous meeting will be corrected. You don't correct them in your minutes that you're taking for your current meeting, but you approve the minutes as corrected. Then that leads the reader back to the minutes, and they can read it and see what was corrected. So we're going to talk about motions because that's generally the most talked about subject when you come to Robert's Rules of Order. You can only have one motion on the floor at a time. They are debatable, amendable, and can be reconsidered. They must be seconded. They mostly require a majority vote. You can consider or dispose of the motion. And the chairperson puts the motion to a vote. And the chairperson announces the results. So let's talk about how we do this. The member making the motion asks permission from the chairperson to make a motion. Then the chairperson gives permission. The member then makes the motion stating, "I move to." Now, when that motion is made, it really needs to be clear, and it needs to be as uncomplicated as possible. Because if you start making complicated motions, it's difficult for the body, the assembly, to remember, and it's also difficult for the chairperson to remember how the motion is going to be presented to the body. One of the tips that I would give is that if there is a motion, it should be in writing. And you can just write it out quickly. Now, the chairperson can also ask for assistance in restating the motion. And the person that the chairperson can ask is the secretary. So it behooves the secretary to make sure that they provide the information to the motion. And if it is seconded, it is not any longer owned by the person making the motion. Now it is owned by the assembly, the group. It cannot be just changed without another motion. So if when the motion was made and it was seconded, and the person says, "Oh, wait a minute, no, it won't happen." You need to then come back and amend the motion. Once it is seconded and open to the floor, the chairperson then can ask for debate. The group debates the motion, and at that time it can no longer be changed or withdrawn without the consent of the body. Therefore, then there's a motion that comes out asking for it to be changed, seconded, and the body needs to vote on it. So I'm going to give you just a really easy example. I'm going to make a motion that a table needs to be painted brown. It's seconded. There is debate, and the debate is, someone comes with a motion saying, "No, I think the table should be green." And they make that into a motion, and then that gets seconded. So now we have an amendment to the motion. Then there's further discussion, and it's decided that it's going to go to committee because the Environmental Housing Authority needs to review that table that needs to be painted. So how do you take care of that? Well, one, you have to start with, think of it as a ladder. You have to think of the last one that was, you went up the ladder with making the motions. Now you have to come back down the ladder to deal with your motions. So if it is decided to go to committee, that motion is on the table, and it's been seconded, the group can then vote to send it to committee. Once that has happened, it's done. It's gone off to committee. And you don't have to worry about the other two motions because they've been deflated. Now, it didn't get approved by the group to go to committee, thinking that it was a waste of the committee's time to go and decide what color to paint the table. So now we are back to the amendment. And then the amendment needs to be voted on, yay or nay, on changing the color to green. If that gets passed, then the motion is that the table's going to be painted green and it passes. But if it doesn't get passed, now we're going back to the original motion that was made, the main motion, and the main motion then gets voted on. Now it can get passed or it can get defeated. Also, I need to state that the chairperson is the one who keeps you going down the right road. Therefore, if you want to make a motion, you just don't start talking. You ask the chairperson for permission to make a motion. If you want to talk during the debate, you ask to be recognized by the chairperson. Now, I kind of was thinking that you had little buttons on your table and you could press them so that there was a light that could tell the chairperson, but I think you're going to have, I understand that that does not occur here. So it may be that you need to look at that some type of system that can help the chairperson, because unless she has fantastic peripheral vision, you're not going to see everyone who wants to put their hand up to talk. And you shouldn't start talking until the chairperson acknowledges you or recognizes you. But she can ask the secretary to help define who's indicated that they would like to talk by putting their hand up and in what order that was. So it doesn't necessarily have to only be the chairperson. She can ask for assistance. Yes, you can.
So on your table, we had the brown and the green. And you
Yes.
said go back to committee. So to go back to committee, is there a motion to go back to committee? Who decides it goes back
There
to
was
committee?
I had stated that there was a motion to go to committee.
Okay, so
And
someone
then
has
that
to-
was turned down.
No, what I'm saying, to have, if the board wants to go to committee, so we can't decide on brown or green.
Yeah, you can make a motion to send it to committee.
Okay, so
And
someone,
then it's seconded and then passed by
Okay.
the majority. Then it can go off to committee, and then that's the end of that in that meeting until. But one of the keys that you got to remember too, when you send it off to committee, you need to remember to send it off to committee with some instructions. You know, what do you want them to accomplish? Do you give them any power? You know, do they have to price out, you know, the paint or whatever? I mean, you just don't say, okay, I'm going to give it to the housing committee and make their decision. Especially if there's been debate on it, you should probably put in the motion to go to committee, what exactly you would like to have done. And then my personal opinion is you give them a time frame to come back. It's also in the motion, so it doesn't get lost out there somewhere. Also, the chairperson is the one who keeps control of time. If you read Robert's Rules of Order, the suggestion is that no one have more than 10 minutes worth of time to talk about any particular debate. You can adjust that to whatever your preference is. That's just a suggestion that they're stating. Again, a tip for a motion. I believe that even just writing it out even helps you. You can think of a motion as a diagramming a sentence. You want to be able to put it out there and have as much information in it, but also be as clear. And you can just pass that down to the chairperson, and then you won't have any issues with that. And try not to be too technical or too strict, which sometimes that's difficult to have happen depending on what subject you're talking about, but it certainly does make it better for the group in whole. Also, according to Robert's Rules of Order, when we're talking about you have 10 minutes to talk and talk about a subject, you can't yield your remaining 8 minutes to somebody else. That's not acceptable in the Robert's Rules of Order. And then also remember to address the chair when you're debating. You're not talking to any particular individual in the meeting. It all goes through the chair. And then also, common courtesy says that you use the chair's name. And since this is an entity, a public entity, it would be courteous to use your proper names so that you're not making it too informal by using just first names. Mr. Wong, you would use that rather than calling him John. As I said, the rank of motions is like a stepladder, and you have to keep thinking of that. You have your main motion, you can amend it, you can send it to committee, you can postpone it, or you can ask the question. And then as you have those sections, you have to deal with those sections before you get back down to the main motion. And we have subsidiary motions that you can do. Postponing indefinitely. That kills the main motion without a direct vote on it. You can amend it, which modifies it, sometimes in the main motion before the group acts on the motion. You can send it to committee for further investigation, and again, you need to inform the committee as to what you want accomplished, what they need to accomplish, and if they have any powers. Postponing indefinitely puts off the question until an expressed time, and that you need to make sure that you put the time in there. You can, as I said earlier, you can limit or extend the debate, shorten it if you want to. You can close the debate and amendments by asking the question. And then you can lay on the table, which interrupts the business, to introduce more urgent business. Yes, Mrs. Charles? you, as the chairperson, have the ability to explain that there has not been sufficient time for discussion.
So even if he gets a second, I can say we're not going to vote on that?
You can do that as the chairperson. Now, they may push on it, and then you can go ahead and call the question, or continue with the question, and have a vote and hope that it doesn't succeed, because more people will want to have the discussion. But you, as the chairperson, can extend the debate.
Not if it's successful.
No, not if it's successful. That's correct.
All right, thank you.
Oh, I get subsidiary motion characteristics, they apply to the motion and they do something or they make them change. They may be applied to any main motion, and they may be applied at any time from when the chairperson states a question to the time of the question being asked for the vote. Privileged motions. There may be such a thing as someone is confused about the rank and order of the items to be discussed, and you can ask for clarification. You can raise a question of privilege. That's, putting, if there's an emergency that needs to be discussed. If there needs to be a short break, you can ask for a recess. Adjourning closes the meeting, but be careful on how that's used, because then if someone wants to call for the adjournment, that needs a second and that needs to be voted on. But if all the business on your published agenda has been taken care of, the chairperson can ask for the adjournment, and that doesn't need a second, and that ends the meeting. You can also ask for an adjournment and to fix the time if something has been going for a long period of time and it's 8 o'clock and you can say, okay, we're going to have a motion to adjourn the meeting at 10 o'clock. Then at 10 o'clock comes, it's complete. Yes?
So, at the end of the meeting, you go through the business meeting, the chairman doesn't have to ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
That's correct.
The chairman just says to
If all the items on your published agenda has been completed and you've gone through them and there's nothing laying on the table over here, she can go ahead, the chairperson can go ahead and adjourn.
I'm doing this as a new thing, doing a motion and a vote. And one reason is because I don't want to have it happen. It kind of makes us slow down a second. Sometimes we forgot to do something. And the motion to adjourn is a chance for our secretary to say, hold on a minute, or for
Oh, yes.
to say, hang on, you forgot.
You can go ahead. It doesn't say you can't go ahead and ask for a second. And
That's mainly the reason I do it, because it makes us pause.
yeah, because sometimes you may have forgotten to, you accepted the minutes, but you forgot to do the vote. Something like that can come up, and then that is an opportunity to go back and clarify.
Right, or we might go into closed session, discuss something, and say we're going to come into open session and vote on it, and then we forget to do that.
Right.
So that's happened before too. So, okay, thank you.
Yes. Also, an incidental for point of order, you can appeal, take away a decision from the chairperson and give it to the group to discuss. You can suspend the rules, say that you have a rule that debate will from one individual will not take longer than 10 minutes, but for this particular subject, you are going to change it to 15. Again, that's a second, and then that goes ahead and is voted on. Or you can have a division of the question. You have a motion up there, and you're feeling that it is not going to be understood clearly, and you can break the motion into more than one piece, and then vote on the individual portions of that piece. Again, we talked about this, about adjournment.
Bonnie,
Yes,
could I ask a question?
yes.
If the chair elects at adjournment to call for a motion to adjourn, can she then just simply declare adjournment without a second if there is a motion?
Not if she calls for an adjournment. That it now is being required a second. But if she adjourns, that's not. Right. But if she calls for the adjournment, then that has to have a second and have a vote on.
So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll do that during, I'd like to keep like down in Illinois, we have so much business that we could get mixed up, but maybe in the simpler meetings, we could just like.
No, Ms. Gard.
I had a question when you said that when you make a motion, you can divide it up. So is that one motion, or let's say there's 3 points within the motion, would it be one motion approved and a second?
It's like,
Give me an example.
yes. Say you had a presentation made, and was necessary for the body to approve the presentation. But then also in that presentation was a motion to accept and file the necessary papers that this has been completed. So that there are 2 actions in that motion. So you can divide the motion into 2 motions and have one saying, I move to accept the presentation made to this body and approve that presentation has been completed, because it was a government requirement, say, that was happening. That is one. Then you can go back to the second part of the motion and make that motion, because there may be some money that had to be spent, and you want to clarify that. So you can break someone's motion into divisions.
Would you recommend that, or?
Only if the reason for that rule is that sometimes a motion becomes very cumbersome for the body to understand, or they think that they're approving the presentation and don't realize they're also approving the dollars that are going to be spent because of the presentation. Okay. Yes. Any other questions? I mean, I left plenty of time here for questions, because I can talk about the various rules, and we walk through the order that they are presented. And as an enthusiast, and if anybody's been in a meeting that I run, and John's smiling, I'm a stickler for starting on time, for getting through the agenda, and I have most of the agenda reports I put under a consent agenda, because I expect members of the board to be professional enough to read the information provided to them in advance, especially committee reports. And then we come to the meeting, and if everyone is in agreement, we pass the consent agenda. But if somebody has an issue with one of the committee reports, we take it off the consent agenda, bring it back out into the agenda, and talk about it at length as to whatever the reason for bringing it off the agenda. Then that gives us more opportunity in a meeting to do what we're there for, to either educate ourselves or to be able to discuss new programs or points of interest that the board needs to have. And then when I publish, a meeting will end at a given time. It will end at a given time. Yes?
Talk about the abstention again. I thought you said if you abstain, it's a no vote, but isn't it just the absence of a vote?
But if you're looking for quorum, and you're looking for, if you have a majority, that is a no vote,
Okay, but let's say that,
because no one has voted.
so let's say someone with a conflict of interest
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's a no vote.
going to, well, let's say, let's say the motion is to make, my husband a medical director, okay? And there's a, no, let's say the motion is to make Dr. Smith a medical director, and I think, no, I want my husband to be it. If I abstain, I'd be voting no against Dr. Smith, and it would work in my favor. So isn't it really an absence of a vote? If I abstain, I remove myself from the vote.
But you haven't removed yourself from the quorum.
No, but I've removed myself from the vote, so it means that,
It is a no vote.
okay, then you could help yourself, is what I'm saying. If you have a conflict of interest, voting no could actually, if you have an interest, not a conflict, but if you have an interest, voting no could be in
Well,
your favor.
you need to go back to your bylaws as to what your bylaws state, because in Robert's Rules of Order, conflict of interest is not really considered to be a problem. Okay? But in your bylaws, you may consider conflict of interest a problem.
Right, so if you vote, I mean, if you vote no, you're voting when maybe your bylaws say you should be abstaining, that's my point. So if you abstain,
Then you need to look at your bylaws say with regards to what is, how do you count your quorum for that vote? And how do you account for the people who are going to be voting for that particular issue?
so if we have one person abstaining and six yes votes, then I would say it passes with,
The majority.
yeah, with one abstention. I would say 6 yes and 1 no. Correct?
No, I don't know what your bylaw says with regards to abstentions. But Robert's Rules of Order says that that is a no vote.
Our bylaws just say you can't abstain unless you have a conflict of interest. And then you can abstain. You have to vote unless you have a conflict of interest.
So how does it count your quorum for that particular vote then?
Quorum or majority?
Well, the people, the majority.
Yeah, you still need to have 4,
You still have to have a majority.
correct, Michelle? You still need 4 to pass it.
Yes, but my question to Bonnie would be, so if we have seven board members and 3 vote aye, 3 vote nay, and 1 abstains, does that mean the motion fails according to Robert's rules?
Yes.
Well, it feels like this.
Yes.
3 is a fail.
Okay, so then take the example of you have 6 members, because 1 is absent, like tonight, 3 vote aye, 2 vote nay, and 1 abstention. Is that still a fail?
That's still a fail because that's 3 no's.
Because in the way we've been practicing, we would say that that would be a favorable vote because we've not counted the abstention based on the way we have handled an abstention in the last umpteen years that I've been serving as the board secretary.
So remember my disclaimer
Right.
in the beginning. I'm not your legal counsel and I don't know what your bylaws say. Okay.
But if we go to, let's say we only have a quorum here, a quorum present, 4 people,
Right.
then all we need is 3 to pass something. So that's when what you're saying could make a difference.
If,
If we have
right, I could see the issue.
and 1
Yeah.
Right.
abstention,
Can't answer that for you.
Is a person allowed to abstain with no conflict of interest?
Well, they have the right to abstain, but it becomes a no vote in Robert's Rules of Order. Again, I don't know about your bylaws.
So technically, if you could abstain, you want to vote no, but you say abstain, and if that's our bylaw, we say it's 3 votes.
But your qualifications for being on this panel is to vote, whether it's yes or no. That's your fiduciary responsibility.
I know, but you,
Yeah,
instances in the past where people have done that.
right, exactly right.
The point is that if someone wants to play that game, then bring it back. If someone wants to play that game, we say, if someone says, well, I abstained in the vote, well, no, you voted no. And that's the response to the board, you voted no. So, okay. I have, if I could change, I have, if you could explain 3 things that always confuse me. Call the question, previous question, table. We talked a little about table before we started, but if you could clarify those 3 things. And then I'd like to come back to the committee report. This board historically reads the report like a book report, which I find a waste of time, but on the other hand, there's a suggestion that it informs the public because we're a public board. So it's different than a private board. So I don't.
Are your committee reports on your website?
Yeah.
I thought they were.
Everything's
yeah.
public information.
Yeah, right.
So, but when we come here, because these meetings last night went till 10:30, and we have extensive discussions that go on and on, but in between, we have reports that we go through it one by one by one. And as a board member, I always read it before I come to the meeting, and I find it frustrating. But I understand other board members that think it's their obligation to inform the public that is watching. So it's kind of a headbutter. But
Yeah, as you said, it's different between a public organization and a private organization.
But if you could explain those 3, because
So call
I
up
think
the
they're
question.
misused sometimes.
I'm sorry. And what was the third one?
Call a question, previous question, and table.
Table.
I
yeah.
wish to table
Okay.
the motion.
Call of the question is when you are in the middle of debate. And I also caution you about calling the question during the middle of a debate when someone is talking. You're out of order then, and if you call the question, it should be thrown out. That's exactly right. And so when the discussion has stopped, when that person has stopped talking, someone then can move to call the question. But they needed to be acknowledged by the chairperson. You just don't call it out of the room. This is not your dining room table or, where, I don't know who has Robert's Rules of Order at their Thanksgiving dinner, but but you need to be able to have the rules and decorum when you're asking for them. So that's the call of the question. The previous question is to again to be asking for a vote when you have the ladder and you want to get down to that main discussion. You have to deal with whatever still is outstanding before you get down to the main motion. And then you can ask for the question. But you can also ask for the question for in an amendable area or whatever else you're doing on the ladder. And table. Table happens, in my opinion, to be misused. It's better to be able, because sometimes it can be put on the table and then you have hopes that it was going to be taken care of at the end of the meeting to decide whether or not, if it's going to be discussed and put on the agenda for the next month, or how is it going to be disposed, and many times it's forgotten. It would be better to use, to postpone and then to put a time factor with that postponement, whether that postponement is for the next meeting or 2 meetings from now, so that it is on the agenda and then it moves to the next meeting.
So when we're in a committee meeting and someone says, let's table this,
Oh, okay, wait a minute. We're not talking about a committee meeting. Okay,
okay,
because you've got a few other,
because we still follow Robert's rules in committee, so
Right.
it's different.
it's just a little bit different. In a committee, if you go ahead and say you want to table this, you can then have to determine what the next committee date will be and that this will be on the agenda.
Okay, so, but in the board
Because
meeting-
many times the committee agendas aren't published. They should be, but sometimes they're not.
Well, ours are. But,
Yes, okay.
But in the board meeting like we had last night, it would be, I move to postpone this until January 25th.
Hmm.
That would be the appropriate way
That's
instead of saying tabling it until.
That's right.
And then I don't,
That's an easier way and a faster way to make sure that it's not forgotten.
okay, we use the term a lot, friendly amendment. What's the difference between an amendment and a friendly amendment?
Well, a friendly
Then you do
amendment should only be for a word or two, and it needs to be done before the second. Okay? Because once it becomes seconded, it is now owned by the assembly, by the whole group, and not by the person who you're asking to make the friendly amendment for.
Because normally what I've seen happen is we've had the second, we've had the discussion, and then someone says, can I offer a friendly amendment? Is that-
That's a privilege, which can or does not have to be honored. It doesn't have to be. And then what happens there is that from that friendly, what'd you call it?
Friendly amendment.
Friendly amendment, then you have to go back to the amendment stage and make it as a formal amendment. And then you vote on that, and then you go back to the main motion.
So we really don't need to say friendly amendment, right?
No,
So friendly
No.
amendment really is
you're trying to be
before a
nice.
second.
Yeah,
Okay. And for clarification or adding,
yes,
okay.
you're welcome.
I don't know if we talked about this before the meeting started or if it was during, but the way the sweater explained it is it belongs to the maker of the motion before it's seconded. And so you could say, ask for a friendly amendment, and then he or she can change it.
But once it's second,
It belongs to everybody.
Right.
And that's why you have to do the formal amendment question. And then like last night, I was asking, when we had one member make a motion and it wasn't really clear, and I was paused thinking about how to fix it, and then you jumped in and said, what was it you said? Did you say I'd like to make a substitute amendment, Jeff? Did you say substitute, or? It was,
Kyle, that was on the WASB.
Yeah, it was on Wendy's motion.
right, so, I think, did you use the word substitute amendment, or did you say I'd like to?
It was 10:15, I remember.
Yeah, so,
a substitute amendment, you need to make an amendment.
I mean, a substitute motion, I thought maybe he said that, but, so the proper thing to do, if someone makes a motion, it's made, it's seconded, and then we're sitting there going, that doesn't sound quite right, the proper thing to do is what?
Well, you can amend it, but if it's too complicated or it changes the overall motion, then if it does that, then you vote on it, hopefully you vote against it, and then you start all over again.
I think last night, Pam, there was no second. Because when Wendy said it, it's like.
No, there was, because I remember thinking, what do we do now? It's made, it's seconded, and then when you made yours, I knew you were saying the right thing, and you were rewording it correctly, and so I wanted to just go forward with it, but I was thinking, is it being done right? And then Kyle said that he thinks you said a substitute motion.
I have
And
no
is
idea.
there such a thing as a substitute motion? No. So it would just have to, and we
I'm in
did it as,
sales.
Amendment,
we handled it as an amendment.
right, and
That's
that's the
what
right way to do it.
But by amending it with that, it kind of canceled out the whole main motion, because he offered the same motion, just worded differently.
But it was clear to the overall body. That's the key,
Yes.
clarity.
Bonnie, there
Yes.
is a section about midway through that 600 and some odd pages, it's about like that, called Robert's Rules for Small Boards.
Yes,
And it makes some exceptions to some of the formal things because when Roberts did his thing, he was thinking in terms of assemblies of a couple of hundred people.
right. A mass group, they called it.
Right.
Right.
And so there may be some advantage for a board this size to think in terms of what some of the permissible things are for small boards, such as discussing an agenda item before a motion is made, and some of those kinds of things.
Correct. And also I saw, I think Mr. Larson has the abbreviated short version of Robert's Rules of Order, which really does pinpoint to smaller boards. But I think I was under the impression here that you are a public entity, so there was more stricter rules to follow. But yeah, come see, come solve, right?
They have to obey the law, but they can
Yeah,
be a little careful with the...
right. So I think one of the light bulb moments, if you want to, for with regards to motions, is to view the motion and any amendments or adjustments that you make as the ladder, going up the ladder and then coming down the ladder. You have to take care of those runs on the ladder individually before you can take care of the main motion. Mrs. Childs?
Well, I've often wondered about the same thing that Dr. Childs was just saying. You know,
There is a whole section
there is.
about smaller boards.
And it's
Yes.
it's much more casual.
Right.
And
But you also have to remember you're a public entity and
Right.
you are being viewed by the public and you need to show professionalism.
that's why we've stuck with it. And then, I mean, it's tempting when we go into committee meetings to say, let's just go by the Robert's Rules for small committees.
Or
But then-
consensus. You know, a lot of groups will use their committees as consensus. And I will warn you that if your committee goes by consensus and then it brings a proposal back to the board, now your recommendations from a committee have to be seconded. If they go by Robert's Rules of Order in their committee meeting, then when it comes to the board, it does not need a second. It comes as a motion from the committee.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay,
Pearls of wisdom.
thank you.
I have gone over my time, but I certainly would stay here as long as you have questions.
Well, are there any other questions? Yeah, I was just thinking, wait for our next meeting and we'll have plenty of questions for you. But we do have another presenter.
I can watch a meeting and critique you. You know what? I purposely did not watch a meeting before because I didn't want to come with pre-established statements because I wanted you to ask me questions because I did think about that. I thought maybe I'd look at 2 or 3 meetings and come up with some suggestions and alternatives, but then that's after the fact, and that's not necessarily productive either. So I thank you for your time, and I'm not
you.
going anywhere, so you can ask me to come back. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a question?
Oh, sorry.
Just a comment on abstention.
Mm-hmm.
Rules, the Boyd's rule, my understanding of Boyd's rules are a generalized expression that is a guidance for when you establish your the rules that
The bylaws.
bylaws. That abstention is a statement vote where you are stating, I either feel I am conflicted or I have been told that I am in conflict. Therefore, I have removed my vote due to conflict. It's to put it on the record. You abstain, you are putting it on the record that you have a conflict.
Yeah, and abstentions do need to go into the minutes, but it is a no vote. Yes.
So if it goes in the minutes as an abstention,
Yes?
I think maybe what you're saying is it's a lack of a yes vote. Could that be what you're saying? Because if it goes into the minutes as an abstention and a no, you've got 8 votes.
Robert's
But-
rule says it's no vote.
But, exactly right, Doctor. Yes, it's
No way
it's
around
very clear. Robert's Rules of Order says it's a no vote, but you do record it in your minutes so that you can justify the abstention.
So what happens when someone leaves? Because I've seen a board member who had a conflict, what they would do is remove themselves and
Right.
take a walk while the board continued.
Right.
Does that then create the,
You may not have a majority. That's the issue there then.
okay.
Well, I mean, they're
But in
gone.
that moment, is the quorum just the remaining people while that person is out?
Mhm.
And I think that's what,
Yes.
that's how it will happen.
That's what it is. It's the public body that's there when the vote is taken.
So should that be, I guess what we're looking for or sensing is, should that be the way to handle someone who has a serious conflict of interest to remove themselves? But you're just saying.
I'm not
that could be
giving
a
you
way-
legal opinion on
That
that.
could be a way, but you're saying that also could create a situation where you don't have a quorum.
That's correct.
Well, really, wouldn't it be this? So if I abstain for conflict of interest and leave the room, and I'm not there for the vote, I'm not here. So I'm not abstaining, I'm not here.
You're not here, but
So
you
the vote
could.
is what the vote is.
No, if
No,
for the
but you
record,
could-
you have to say you abstained, though.
No, I'm not in the room, I didn't vote. I
He
didn't
wasn't in
abstain.
he wasn't in the room, so he didn't actually say abstain,
abstain.
but it could cause you an issue
Yes.
with regard to your majority, because it's the majority of the people who are voting.
But also, if it wasn't noted in the minutes that someone left the room and what time they got back, and they got back after the vote, I think it's just, we've always put that they abstained. I don't know.
Should be noted in the minutes.
We need to think about this.
If they leave the
Should be
room,
noted in
it
the
should be
minutes.
noted in the minutes.
It is, but the minute they walk back in, I don't know, Michelle,
Every time she left the room, I noted that she left the room.
So-
Every time she came back, I noted that she came back into the room.
and did we,
Just proper.
then did we say that she abstained?
Not if she wasn't in the room when the
Wasn't
vote
in the room, okay. So. if
Somebody
someone-
reading the minutes has to really be careful if you made those notes that they left the room and when they came back and when the vote was taken.
So maybe there's a case where someone with a conflict leaves the room, comes back in right when the vote's happening, and then they say abstain.
I'm giving no legal advice.
No, I mean, that could happen, and then we write down that they abstained. Well, yeah, but you can't stop, yeah. Okay, so we need to definitely have a look at our abstention, and maybe even have
Yeah.
more policy on
Need to
that.
look at your bylaws.
Look at your bylaws and look and see what they say. And then if you need a legal interpretation of your bylaws. But I certainly suggest that maybe it would be helpful to have, when you're having your debate as to who has put their hand up and when and in what order.
And one last question about the voting. If you just say all in favor, and you hear a bunch of ayes, and then you say opposed, and you don't hear any nays, it doesn't matter if someone didn't say anything, they still voted yes.
Yep. When you do a verbal vote, they have to say no.
Okay. All
If
right.
you do, the only time, yeah.
So silence is a yes vote. Michelle?
So do I record them as a yes vote?
You have to do it by individual? Oh, wow. I would, you
Well,
can't,
it
you
would be
can't do that.
unanimous, right?
It would be unanimous vote. You
It's
can
a
have-
public body, and any time the board is voting on anything that has to do with the receipt or expenditure of funds or the adoption of policy, it should be a roll call vote.
Vote. Either that or a
not
ballot.
voice vote.
Exactly
Anything
right.
else could be subject to voice vote.
Yep. And if somebody doesn't voice it, and then comes back and says, I didn't say anything, then you don't, that's too bad.
Okay, any other questions? All right, Mrs. Wetter, thank you again.
Thank
Ms.
you,
Wetter,
I
thank you
enjoyed
again.
it. Have a great day.
We really appreciate your time and your help tonight.
that I received from Pam, that you sent to Pam, and then she sent to me. So if it's not the latest and greatest, we can,
Okay. I've got the other one with me if we need it.
She sent it to me, I think, one day last week. And I came down today and
Okay, so we are going to continue with our workshop this evening, and our next presenter is Mr. Jason Stein, Research Director for Wisconsin Policy Forum. Thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate this this workshop you're going to be doing for us on school funding. We can hear you. Is the mic working okay?
Okay, how's that? Okay, that's better. I know there are people at watching at home, potentially anyway. So wanted to make sure that. So your chairwoman is correct. I am Jason Stein, and I'm the research director for the Wisconsin Policy Forum. We are a relatively new group, so I'll tell you a little bit about us. But first, thank you to all of you for having me, and also for taking on the work that you're doing as school board members. Obviously, you maybe don't get thanked in every venue or occasion, but it really is a service to your community. So thank you for doing it. So the Wisconsin Policy Forum was formed in January by a merger of the Public Policy Forum of Milwaukee and the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance of Madison. And so these two groups are both very long-standing. The Taxpayers Alliance was started in the Depression. The Policy Forum goes more than 100 years old, so it goes all the way back to the Progressive era. And these are both of them are research and education organizations that were nonpartisan. And I know a lot of people say they're nonpartisan these days. A lot of groups will say that, but we are two of the groups that actually mean it. That is something that we really believe in. And so, we're trying to provide everybody with the same set of facts that they can go and then make their case out in the political marketplace for what they feel like ought to happen in Wisconsin policy. So, what do we look at? We look at state and local government, both in the Milwaukee County and southeastern Wisconsin, as well as in the state capital, and in statewide issues of local government and school funding. We look at, obviously, taxes and finance and budgets, economic development, and of course education. So, just a little bit about us. By merging, we have bigger staffs, so it wasn't a situation where, people were laid off or anything like that. We just have a larger organization that's now sort of has two offices, and, a desire to sort of serve people statewide. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here with you tonight. Okay, so we're gonna try and go through the basics of the Wisconsin school finance system and how that relates to the budget of the Beloit School District. So my understanding is that you've had a certain amount of turnover on the board, and so you have some people that may help. And there's been a little bit of turnover in my position as well. I came in May. I have been historically a journalist covering state government, covering the state capitol. I wrote a book about the Act 10 controversy that was called More Than They Bargained For with a colleague. And so I have, my greatest familiarity with school funding and school funding issues has been at the level of the state. And so, there may be a few times when we're talking about local issues or federal issues where I have to say to you, you know what, I'm going to get back to you on that. So, all right. So, go on. Again, we're going to look at this from the history of how did we get here? Where are we now? How does that all tie in with you fine folks in Beloit? So, Wisconsin historically has been, if you will, a local control state where the state's policy has been to leave it up to local elected officials to decide what happens in their communities. There has been some evolution of that, sort of on both sides of the political spectrum over the last couple generations. So what do we mean by that? Well, okay, historically, in the 1970s, you saw the rise of teachers' unions in Wisconsin and other places around the country. You did see some labor management conflict associated with that. For instance, we had a teacher strike in Hortonville that was pretty well known. We had the rise of things that you didn't have before collective bargaining. So you had contract talks and things like that. And along with that came mediation and arbitration of contract talks. So, a situation where both the teachers union and the local school board might not get from the arbiter or the mediator exactly what they had wanted. So, to the extent that happened, that represented a shift away from district control or a mitigation of district local control. Over time, and we'll talk a little bit about this more later, but, for a variety of factors, including, some of those contract talks, you saw an increase in property taxes associated with school districts. and some public concern about that. And obviously in Wisconsin, there's a lot of factors that contribute to the level of property taxes, which historically have been higher than the national average and are a little closer to the national average now, in recent years. And obviously in Wisconsin, not just at the school district level, but local city and county government, even technical colleges, Wisconsin is very heavily reliant on the property tax, which is again one reason why, and less reliant on other types of funding like sales taxes for cities, for example. That's something that, or even income taxes for cities. You see that in other states. You don't, except in very limited contexts, you don't see it in Wisconsin. So I don't mean to imply that school districts are obviously the biggest piece of the local property tax, but they're not the only piece. So I don't mean to imply that all of that was on school districts. But again, we got to keep this somewhat manageable tonight. So we're not going to get into any of the other local governments that deal with the property tax. Okay, so then in 1993, 1994, oh, and by the way, I hate to ask this. I don't know if there's any, could I get a cup of water? I have a feeling that maybe over the next, 20 minutes, I might, you don't want me, kind of squawking at you. Should have thought of that before. So in 1993-94, the state imposes revenue limits on schools. Now that is also a shift away from local control because, that is the state government saying to school districts, okay, here's how much you can spend from general school aids, and we'll talk about what those are in a little bit, and the local property tax, okay? So as this happens, again, as I said, the revenue limits, they link property taxes and school aid, meaning that the decision, and this is typically done within the state budget every 2 years, in every even numbered, I was right the first time, odd numbered year. So we didn't have a budget this year. Next year in 2019, the next governor and the next legislature will have a budget, and they will very likely set revenue limits for schools and also how much general aid the school districts will get. And that will have a real big impact on what you folks can do at the local level, and we'll talk about that. And then lastly, in 2011, the Wisconsin Act 10 was passed, which repealed most collective bargaining for public employees, including teachers and other school district employees. And that again, had an impact on what decisions could be made at the local level. Districts had fewer labor constraints after that, but then they also had, some budget pressures. And also around that same time as you had that shift to Republican control at the state legislature, you also see tighter revenue limits and smaller increases in property taxes, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a bit. Okay, so just kind of running through this quickly, here's what things look like in terms of property taxes in the 80s and early 90s. And on a couple of these slides, the increases on the bottom may be a little bit bigger than the slides, so I'll point that out to you in a second. All right, so we've already gone over this a little bit, but again, you have this imposition of revenue limits, and that revenue limits goes on district by district at the level that they're spending at that time out of these couple of sources. And so over time it grows, but even today, more than 20 years later, you still have this link between what districts are spending now and what they were spending then. And if you were a district that happened to be spending at a high level, oh, thank you, sir, you're going to have more ability to spend it today. And if you were spending at a lower level, if you just happened to be spending at a lower level in the 90s, absent a referendum, you're still in that position. Okay. So the other thing is that you had in 96, 97, you had a $1 billion infusion of state aid that drove down property taxes. Why? Again, because this is like a zero-sum game. there's only so much money that a school district can spend out of the property tax and general aid. If I give you another dollar of state aid, that's a dollar less that you're going to be getting from the property tax, and vice versa. If I take a dollar of state aid away from you, that's another dollar that you can increase property taxes. And that, same thing in the 05-07 state budget. You saw aids going up in the 2005-2006 year. And what do those things have in common? Well, they happen to come before election years. So, that is something that we see sometimes in politics from both parties. Okay, so there you see that period as that big infusion of state aid came in. You see that big increase in property taxes there in 97, and you see, in the era of revenue limits in general, property taxes being somewhat less than they were, leading, in the decade prior to revenue limits. Okay. But again, here when you see, an even, probably more significant change is in the last, since 2011, when you have, actually a decrease in for 1 year of, I think it would have been 5.5% there at the beginning of this current period in the revenue limit, and then you have again. The revenue limit, being held in some years at zero. Again, you see, much, smaller increases in property taxes statewide. And of course, district by district, that's gonna change, and we can talk a little bit about why that changes. But okay, and so now we talked, at least about one of the major revenues that a school district has. We'll talk a second about spending for school districts. So historically, Wisconsin has been above the national average in terms of how much we spend per pupil. But as you can see, that gap has been narrowing over the past decade, and then and there's a lag in the data, so we don't get to see the most recent years. But, or at least we don't get to compare them to the nation. We know what's happening in Wisconsin, but it's harder to compare to the nation. But you do see that has reversed more recently. Some of that spending can be due to kind of it's obviously many different factors, but one thing that's worth noting is a piece of that had to do sort of traditionally up until 2011, our benefit structure for public employees in general, and in particular in teachers, tended to be higher than the national averages. When you looked at the salaries of the workers, they were not that much out of line with the national averages, but you did tend to see more spending on the benefits side. And obviously, as you know, when you're running a school district, labor is your main cost. It's what you do, right, to teach these children. So, and there's reasons why that happened. I don't want to get too much into it because it doesn't even exist anymore, but there was something called the Qualified Economic Offer that led to, in the context of labor negotiations, it made it more likely that increases in compensation would come in the form of benefits as opposed to salary. And so that was part of the thing that drove that difference. And it could be something that sometimes I think if you were a teacher that was, late in your career and maybe had, you had healthcare spending and stuff like that, that might be something that worked out well for you, that there was, the compensation was sort of tilted in that direction a little bit. Obviously, if you were somebody at the beginning of your career, you didn't have as many, needs maybe on the healthcare or retirement side, but you had, you needed a salary to buy a house and things like that, might have been maybe a little less ideal for you. Okay, So now we'll talk a little bit about where the money comes from to do all the things that you guys need to do in your role as a school district. So first off, it's state government, and it's going to vary by district whether your most important source of money is state aid or local property taxes. But again, statewide, it's state aid. Well, both state aid and property tax are important at statewide level. But there's two kinds of state aid. Both there's general aids and categorical aids. And general aids are the money that comes to a school district to just do everything that it needs to do. And then categorical aids are those that are for, isn't that a great word, categorical? It's this wasn't done by marketing people. You can tell that. Categorical aids are streams of money that come for specific things that you folks want to do. So, these would be things like special education, transportation. If you're a district like in a rural area, high cost transportation, or if you're a district that is in a sparsely populated area, there's something called sparsity aid. There's a whole series of these categorical aids, including one that is relatively new, that is come in just in the last few years, and that is something called the per pupil aid, and that is a flat amount of money that comes to school districts per pupil. It was something that the current current party in power put into place in Madison, and that it started out as a relatively modest amount. But the last several years, it's been going up by a couple $100 each year. So I think last year it was $450, and this year it's $650. So it's become a significant part of school funding. And we can talk about why that form of funding has arisen, but part of why it matters is these categorical aids are outside the revenue limits. And so there's implications of that, and it's the general aids that are inside the revenue limits. And so there's a lot of implications from that we can talk about. Property taxes, you know what those are. Federal aid, and again, it's not my strong suit, but that is aid that comes to districts for children living in poverty, children with disabilities, things like that, to help you address special needs and challenges that you have in educating students. And then finally, fees and charges. So these would be a whole variety of things. I mean, I'm sure on Friday night you guys will have a football game. You'll probably charge people money for showing up there. Actually, just 2 weeks ago was my son's school, Madison West, had homecoming and played Beloit. So I saw many of your members there. I was impressed. You had a lot of people come, make it all the way up. It's kind of a cold night, so you clearly have some school spirit. So those are your fees and charges. Yeah. Well, we won't talk about the outcome of the game, but we take any victory that we can get in football at Madison West. That's for sure. They're not every homecoming do we get that. Okay, so we'll just start out with the federal aid. So there's and I apologize. I had to turn this around somewhat quickly, and so I wasn't able to update all of these numbers, but at least you get a sense for where things have been at historically for you folks. And I don't think there would be radical changes in these numbers. So there's Beloit compared to the statewide average in federal aid. There's Beloit compared to the statewide average. This is again in 14-15 in state in categorical aid from the state. All right, there we go. So there's general aid. So there you can see the importance, particularly in districts that do not have a lot of property value per student general aid is by far the most important thing for districts in that position, and we can talk more about why that is. Okay, so there you can see the local property tax, and again, you can see that the amounts sort of vary by, in the state average, the state aid, state general aid in 14-15, and the property tax are very similar to one another. It's a little bit different in Beloit, and we can talk about some of the factors that contribute to that. In general. Okay, so let's try and put this all together. How am I doing for time? Okay, got to keep moving. So the district's characteristics determine federal aid and state categorical aid. Are you a rural district? Are you an urban district? Do you have, many special needs students? Do you have a lesser number of that? So that stuff gets determined by, who you are and where you're located and things like that. The state determines general aid every budget, and that formula includes the number of students, property values, and prior year spending, and we'll talk more about that formula a little bit. That's the kind of part where everybody's head hurts a little bit. Maybe somebody's thinking, I'm already at that part. But anyway, the state determines revenue limits, and then property taxes, the maximum that a board can choose to increase property taxes is determined by general aid and revenue limits. But there is sort of a relief valve that voters can exceed limits through referenda, either to borrow money or to just add money to their yearly operating budget. Okay, so there you go. There's all the columns together and numbers together. Okay, so the revenue limits are calculated per student. So this would have been, as of several years ago, Beloit was sort of in the middle of the pack out of the 400 odd school districts in Wisconsin. I think it's maybe 421 today. Again, I sort of talked to you a little bit earlier about how these are based on 94 amounts, and they increase every year, but some of that original disparity between high and low spending districts is still there today. The increase was traditionally tied to inflation, but that is no longer the case. And as I mentioned, in 15-16 and 16-17, the revenue limits didn't go up. Then your revenue limits it's not just because it's per student, it matters how many students you have, and we'll talk about that. And again, you often hear people talk about aid from the state, but in many ways, for what you ladies and gentlemen, are doing here, the revenue limits can matter more. Okay, so I mentioned to you that what happens with your enrollment matters, and I'll just give you a little illustration of this. This is a district with 2,500 students. They were in 2000. They were spending $7,500 a student, and for 15 years they had no change in enrollment. Which, how did they manage that? Right? That's pretty nifty. All right, so this is what that same district would look like if their student count is growing 1% a year. Okay, so they actually would have almost $4 million more a year in their budget after 15 years, just because the impact of just that student body growing every year. Okay, now let's take a district that is losing students, either because they're a rural district or because they're a district in an urban area that maybe is having students go to private or independent charter schools or that sort of thing. There's a decrease over time, obviously, and that adds up to, in year 15, $7.5 million almost dollars a year, and the cumulative difference over 15 years is $57 million. So that's pretty significant, in part because as a school district, it's not like you're running a Starbucks here, as you are aware, that you can't necessarily just have fewer people working the restaurant shift. Starbucks, if they don't have as many customers, they could shut down a Starbucks. Whereas a school district, you don't have the option of not offering second grade. You may be, in cases, able to have fewer teachers. You might, in some cases, shut down an actual building, although there would be a lot of public discussion about that. So one of the challenges is, as long as you don't have to build a new school, if you're getting more students, you're becoming a little bit more efficient every year. If you're getting fewer students, you're becoming a little bit less efficient every year because you're spreading those fixed costs that you have over a smaller number of students and a smaller amount of state aid and revenue limit. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Doing okay? Okay, great. So what is the point of general aids, which also get called equalization aids? That's another really catchy title, isn't it? So the goal of these aids is to, at least, in general, speaking generally, to equalize tax rates. Okay, what does that mean? That means that to ensure that districts that have the same spending also have the same tax rate, setting aside what their property values are. Okay, so for instance, in Beloit, let's say Beloit and Whitnall, it's a suburban Milwaukee district. They have basically the same costs. Okay, but in terms of the property value per student, the suburban Milwaukee district has a much higher amount. So in part, the goal of equalization aids is to say that same tax rate, that same mill rate per $1,000 of value of home is the same between those two different districts. So that is sort of and this is in the real world, it isn't quite that simple because there's other factors like Fund 80. There's other things that you can raise the property tax for, like community recreations and so on. But I'm just trying to give you, in a nutshell, the basics of it. Okay, a little bit more about how we do this formula for general aids. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
A quick question. Okay, back at that slide. So, just for people that are watching, the property value is much higher in Whitnall than it is in Beloit.
Right.
The mill rate, which is how many dollars per
$1,000 of assessed value
charge, is the same. So what you're saying is Beloit is going to get a lot more money from the state,
right,
and Whitnall is going to get a lot less.
Right. That's right. And is therefore going to take more from the property tax,
right,
to get to that same amount, which let's say for the sake of argument that they're both at their revenue limit, that you both are there. So for every dollar less in state aid that Whitnall receives, to the extent that they want to stay at the revenue limit, then they're going to put another dollar on the property tax
levy. So this is what we're talking about when we tell people that we get like 80% back from the state. Whitnall would not be able to say that. Right. So, there's a really wide range across the state. So, you would have some districts that would not receive general aid, although out of the 420, it would be it'd be a small number. You would have districts that would receive a very large share of their spending would be covered by state aid, and then you have a sort of continuum, a spectrum in between. And then you also have some districts that actually pay into the state aid, right, and don't get anything back, but they actually lose money.
So, and again, here's where I start to get to the limit of my pay grade, but I think historically that was true prior to a Supreme Court decision, and that was, now you do have something called negative aid, but it's not a situation where the district is actually paying in anymore to other districts. The negative aid is something that actually, we'll get into it, but it's just basically, it's a situation where people are having their aid reduced, what they would otherwise get from the state reduced. And Dr. Childs, does that
Thank
sound
you.
about right to you?
That's exactly.
Okay.
I'm sorry. That's exactly right. The negative tertiary aids hits high property
Right, right.
districts, and initially that money was funneled off to the Milwaukee School District, and now it's just washed back into the general funds.
Yeah, yeah, and so what we can talk. I can certainly talk to you a lot about how it works now, but I think you're right that at one time there was districts were actually paying money to other districts, and now it's about how much you're going to get from the state. Okay, so again, here's the basics of the formula. It's the number of pupils in a district, and for each one of these things, we could go into all kinds of little subcategories. Like for students, like, what is a 4K student? Could be half a student instead of a full student. That we could sort of go off on tangents on each one of these, but I'm trying to keep it as relatively simple for you. Because again, you have a finance director. You're not going to have to sit down and calculate this yourselves. The districts, so the next factor is the districts and the state's shared costs, which refers to the eligible spending for this. So it's essentially, what are you guys spending that is not covered by something else like categorical aids or federal aids or fees, interest income? That's kind of how you get to shared costs. So again, there's a definition in statute for all these things. I'm not going to go too deeply into it for you. The equalized property value in the district is important, and then the amount of property value that is guaranteed to districts by the state. And that is probably not going to make a ton of sense to some of you at this moment, but just bear with me here. As I talked about, some of these enrollments are, how the formula treats students is somewhat different. If you're talking about a 4-year-old kindergarten, how much in the day is that? A K through 8 district versus a 9 through 12 district, but that's sort of beyond. You guys don't have to worry about that. You're here in a K-12 district. What you do need to know at least a little bit about is that there are 3 tiers of calculations that you use to get to this general aid number, and that's what Dr. Childs was referring to there. Each of them uses a different version of the same basic formula to determine an amount at each tier, and then you add or subtract those numbers together to get your aid total. And we'll go through that a little bit more. All right. So the first part of general aid is the primary tier. It covers the first $1,000 of spending per student. This is the first $1,000 that gets covered by the district and the state together. And the formula uses district property values to determine how much of this spending is covered by the state and how much is covered by the district. So the more property value you have per student, then the less you will get from the state and the more you will get from your levy, and vice versa. And they sometimes talk about guaranteed property value, and it's almost as if, let's say, to just sort of speak metaphorically, it's almost as if you saw how Whitnall has more property value. It's almost like the state came in and put up an imaginary building, that was an imaginary building that had a value that made up that difference. And then, the state contributed money as if it was the property taxpayer for that imaginary building, right? So that the districts are, it would be as if they had the same property value per student in each district. Okay, so the primary value The guaranteed property value by the state is the highest, at least going into the current budget in 17. It was just a little under $2 million per eligible student, under the definition. And most districts are able to get some aid under this part of the formula, and this aid cannot be lost, so that you can't subtract from it. If you get some aid in the primary section, you get to keep it. Okay, then the secondary amount is $1,000 toward a certain number. I think it might be like 90% of statewide spending. Don't worry too much about that, but that upper number, the 9,500, changes year by year. And then the guaranteed property value that each district gets is it's like a little over 1 million. So as we go to these tiers, you can just sort of think about the property value in the primary tier is about 2 million, and then it gets kind of cut in half at each level. Okay. And again, if you have less property tax value per student than the guaranteed value, then the state will give you some amount of money. The lower you are, the more you would get. So if you get if you're below in the secondary amount, then that amount would be added to the primary amount for you. But if you're above the guaranteed valuation at the secondary level, then you're actually going to lose money, or you would not get money, because again, you can't subtract it for the primary, but at the secondary level, you don't get money. Then at the tertiary level is where we get the negative aid. Okay, so at the tertiary level, would be the spending as of 17 above $9,500 per student, and there again, at the third level, you get the property values per student going down again, and you start to have quite a few districts that are above that tertiary level, okay, in terms of their property value. If they are, then they have negative aid, or they lose aid, and it comes out of what they were getting at the secondary level, okay? And so you add or subtract all that up, and that would give you your overall general aids. And I would guess that maybe there's a question or two at this point, and if you want to jump in with it, yeah.
I have one. Last night, we were told that Beloit's property values are going up. So
Okay.
unless we reach this number here, we would stay at the same aid we're at.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to think about is that not everybody's, but many people's, in this current expanding economy, many people's property values are going up. So it's not just enough to be going up, it would be, are you going up vis-a-vis everybody else in the state? So you could have a situation where you go up, but you don't go up as much as everybody else goes up.
I see.
And then maybe you actually get more aid, depending on a whole lot of other factors.
Okay.
And it can be very difficult. I mean, it can be even very difficult for lawmakers to predict how all these decisions that they make in the budget will actually play out, even for their own school district, even for their own local school district. Sometimes they're surprised, sometimes not even pleasantly surprised by what happens for their local school district.
But even if we're going up more than other school districts are, even if our property values are going up more than everyone else, there's still this magic number that we would have to pass before our aid would change?
Okay, well, yes and no. As you go up in value, relative to other districts, then your amount of aid would go down. But you have to have property values per student above, in 17 it was 559,000
Okay.
to actually get aid subtracted from what you got at the secondary level.
Okay.
Right. So, if you were at 558, flat, well, you wouldn't lose anything from your secondary level. You just wouldn't get anything at the tertiary level, in sort of gross terms.
Which is part of the whammy of declining enrollment because
Yeah.
as your property values increase and your enrollment declines, your value per pupil increases exponentially.
Right. Yep.
And then you take a big hit on state aid.
That's an excellent point, because there's lots of moving parts to this thing. It's a little bit of a Rube Goldberg machine. So he makes a very good point that, if you're and it compounds too, because to the extent that you're losing students, you're also getting less aid per student, and and the revenue limit is also on fewer students. So it's a compounding thing, and that's why you often hear rural districts talk about that challenge that they face, and there are urban districts that, for different reasons, may also find themselves in sort of a declining enrollment challenge. Okay, so we're just about done here. Then you can ask questions if you have them. The aid is also based on your prior year spending, and reduced spending now can lead to less aid next year. And I've got a little example that I'll use to show you that. And this example is relates to energy exemption, which is something that the legislature eliminated, but I think this basic idea would extend to other things within the budget, so I went ahead and gave you this slide anyway. So let's look at $70.7 million for this hypothetical district is their revenue limit, not factoring in this energy exemption, which was something that once upon a time districts had, that could lead them to higher spending. So in year one, you have $70.7 million in the revenue limit, and we're just keeping obviously the revenue limit for a district would, over several years, would always change, or often change, but we're just going to pretend that it doesn't, just to make this all a little bit more clear. In year one, you have this energy exemption of $5.3 million that increases your total spending from just under 71 to 76 million. Okay, and then your state aid is at 60.9 million. Okay, the next year, that energy exemption has gone away. Whatever energy saving project that was done, that's done. We're back to our old revenue limit of 70.7 million. Oh, but look at our state aid. Now our state aid is up. And so what implications does that have? Well, okay, let's look at what happens with the property tax. So the property tax went up from just under $10 million to $15 million to pay for the spending associated with that energy exemption in year one. But in year two, because of this added spending, the district gets more state aid. So now the property tax actually goes down because the revenue limit is what it is, and the state aid has increased. So now the property taxes actually go down in year two to sort of account for that. Now, because again, this spending number is that shared cost number that we talked about earlier that gets plugged into that formula, and it's based on the prior year. Okay, now in year three, now we're basing our general aid in the formula gets based on what we spent the year before. Well, we were back to normal, quote unquote normal, in the year before, 70.7 million. So now our state aid goes back down to quote unquote normal. It's back down to $61 million again. And what's got to happen with the property tax? Well, to the extent that you're going to stay at your revenue limit, then the property tax has got to come back up again. So that's sort of, again, you can see how many moving pieces there are even in this hypothetical example, which I've pulled tons and tons and tons of moving pieces have been pulled out of. So you can sort of gives you new respect for your district finance director, probably, right? But that gives you a sense about how these things can start to play out at the level of a district. And that's what I've got. If you've got questions for me, I will do my best to answer them now or answer them later.
Any questions? Could you explain how voucher schools affect our school district and the taxpayers?
Sure. So, you know, and this is something that I'd have to look, because there are different voucher programs. There's the Milwaukee voucher program. There's the Racine voucher program. There's the statewide voucher program, which, and I think that, you know, at a certain, though, and then there's also the special needs program. And there have been historically different funding setups for each of those. And as well, you know, then some of them have been changed, like Racine's, I believe, was merged with, the Racine approach was different than the statewide approach, and then it was merged. And so I will stop short of kind of trying to give you a real detailed analysis of how that would work for Beloit. Obviously, one issue is, as there are fewer students in a district that are counted, that go into that enrollment count for either the purposes of the revenue limit or general aids, then there's less money available to the district. And I think by program that differs in terms of whether or not in what situation a student is counted and is not counted. And so I haven't, you know, that's one of those things that I haven't reviewed in the last couple of weeks, so I sort of hesitate to confidently strike out with you on a voyage.
To that very subject, though, again, there's the danger of a double whammy, because if your state aids are going to be reliant on your enrollment, and your enrollment has declined due to open enrollment out of your district, then your net revenues have declined. Yet out of that net revenue, which is now lower, you still have to send a certain amount of money per pupil to those other districts to which those students have enrolled. So you get hit twice.
Yeah. I think it's, you know, we sort of talked about earlier about the challenges that you face if you're a rural district that is declining enrollment because you just don't have as many people living in your community as you used to live. You know, what happens for an urban district potentially, you know, and one that, or any district now, since it's a statewide program, that has, you know, a significant, you know, increase in voucher enrollments is, you know, that may put that district into sort of the situation of being a declining enrollment district when it otherwise would not have been. So that, you know, that sort of speaks to the, in general, funding challenge that can be associated with that. You know, and obviously, you know, that's not a comment for or against the vouchers. That's just a comment on what is the finances on the for the public school, which is sort of the context that we're talking about here.
Because I thought that we were told a year ago that somehow some of the money that we don't get from the state because we've lost students to vouchers actually comes back to us through the taxpayers.
So there have been changes to that program, and I could certainly sort of, you know, provide you guys with some resources in a follow-up. I just, because that is something, you know, it's one of those things that is more part of my passive,
Right.
my passive knowledge base right now than what is top of mind. I hesitate to give, you know, to confidently give you more than that sort of basic understanding in this moment.
That's fine. Thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions, or do we all get it?
One item that I'd like to bring up, though, is that the revenue limit used to be the really big deal that you got your per pupil increase every year, but now they've gone away from that and they've gone to the per pupil aid instead.
Sure.
The revenue limit was a 3-year average of your enrollment, so if you lost some kids, it took 3 years for that to roll through and really impact you.
Mm-hmm.
Now with the per pupil aid, when you lose a kid, you lose that money right away. So there's no more of that softening over
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Pupil aid of $653 is a lot more money than the revenue limit ever went up per pupil as well. So not only does it hit you right away, but it hits you a lot harder now than it used to. And I think the reason
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the per pupil. That was that's an interesting point about when you sort of book those gains or losses from enrollment counts, and not something that I had considered. It's a good point. I think another reason why the per pupil form of aid has been something that's been very popular for for elected officials that do not want to see anybody's property taxes increase. So if if at the statewide level with general aids, if let's say you increase general aids by $200 million statewide and revenue limits by $200 million statewide, then in theory, on average, property taxes should not go up for school districts, except for referenda and things like that in general. But that's in general, and district by district, you can still have lots of things happening. You can have some districts getting more and their property tax is actually going down, and other places their property tax is actually going up, maybe sometimes even by a lot, depending on what's happening in that district. And so I think if some policymakers that don't want to see any increase in property taxes, even one that is on average not there, have turned to that per pupil increase, because all of that, the other side of it is you can increase aid, general aid, but not increase the revenue limit. Okay, well then property taxes will just go down. What's the rub to that? The challenge to that is that the districts actually don't have any more money that they can use to deal with inflationary costs and educate students with. Whereas, the advantage of the per pupil is that it is money that districts can spend. It's new money that districts can spend when it goes up. The flip side of it is, though, that it is also apportioned on it's kind of a flat tax, if you will. It's a flat amount per student. Whereas again, if your district has a lot of property value, you will get $650 per student. If your district has very little property tax value, you will get $650 per student. So it doesn't have that equalizing effect, in terms of local, overall local, property taxes and finance that the general aid has. Some people like that. If you are from a suburban district that has a lot of property value, you may say to yourself, well, that sounds pretty good. If you're from a district that is, rural or urban and doesn't have that property tax base, you might much prefer to see that aid come in the form of the general formula and an increase in the revenue limit, and that is sort of the push and pull politically that happens in the state capitol.
Mr. Stein, the one thing I'm still confused on is the difference in negative aid. Yeah. And how I phrased it earlier, which was you pay back. What is negative aid actually?
In a nutshell, it's a case where, in the third tier, your property value per student is above this $559,000, which is at least for 2017. And, if you're 25% above, then that's a 25%, reduction. And so then that comes out of your secondary aid.
I see.
Yeah.
So you're not actually sending money to the state, but you're not getting paid at the lower lower
And I think
level.
I was just to do this, I was just reviewing some of the literature on it, and as I recall, that was something that in 2000, roughly 2000, there was a court case in which the previous practice in which there had been sort of districts paying property tax money in that ended up going to other districts, that process, that practice was ended by that court case. And so, now, negative aid means a different thing than it used to be. So it's
less, you're getting less.
Right.
Okay. And then on one of the early slides, you showed revenue limits. Once we had revenue limits, you showed that property taxes went down pretty drastically.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So we always had this this formula, the primary, secondary, tertiary, we always had equalization, but
Right. The formula has not always been the same. It's been changed over time. I think at one time there was 2 tiers, now there's 3.
But in
So you had-
1997, when we got the revenue limit exemptions, we had this formula before, but you're saying that now that we have revenue limit exemptions, it's basically a similar formula, but the property taxes are lower.
I'm not sure that I grasped all of that. Maybe ask me the question in a different way.
Well, if property taxes went down after revenue limit exemptions,
After revenue limits came into effect in 93, you're saying?
yeah, oh, sorry, I thought it was 97, 93.
I think what you're thinking of is in 1993-94 school year,
I
revenue
keep saying
limits-
revenue limit exemption. I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong term.
Yeah, revenue limits, they came into effect. And then what happened is then in, I think, 96, you had a very large infusion of state aid. And what that does then is that it crowds out property taxes because that revenue cap is in place. This $1 billion of state aid goes, which was obviously a lot more. $1 billion is a lot today. It was even more then. Flows into those district budgets, and because they have to stay under the revenue limits, they've got to lower their property taxes to stay within their limit. And so that's so in a sense the state is buying down the property tax when it does that in a sense.
So I guess what I'm wondering is it doesn't mean that before revenue limits we were spending less per kid. When a property tax went down, it just meant the state was funding more.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess what it means is that, you know, prior to revenue limits, the constraint on property taxes was, you know, really what the school board felt politically and as a policy matter was appropriate, was what the community wanted or would tolerate, and you know, after revenue limits, it becomes, you know, there are certainly districts that don't tax all the way up to their limit, but you know, there is a limit, and to go above it, either to borrow money for a new school or just to have more money in your operating budget from year to year, you have to go to the voters and ask for that. And we have actually seen in recent years, we have seen an increase in that.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Anyone? You look like you have one, maybe?
Yeah, I do.
Make sure your mic is up. Yeah.
So a lot of what you've been talking about is annual budgets.
Yeah.
And when you go to referenda and you
Right.
have that done, is that a whole different pool of money that is accessed at that point? The reason I'm bringing this up is I was very involved in when we had our referendum back 8 years ago.
Okay.
And at that time, I called up and spoke to some people at the state, probably in your offices, and kind of gotten some information or tried to gain a better
I hope we were helpful.
understanding of it. But at that point, you know, and there was a ton of data in the database that you could access regarding property values and you know, how much each city or each district would receive based upon the referendum. And I believe at that time it was about 65% of the referendum was going to be paid for by the state. So, or it was the funding came that was in that percentages. So I'm curious to know a couple of things. I guess where's that funding come from? Is that just a different pool of money when those referendums happen? I mean, because it doesn't just fall out of the sky. And obviously those percentages are similar to what's done on an annual basis.
So let me attempt to address that, and I may address part of your question. I hope. I think maybe just to start, there are 3 types of referenda. So that's maybe we're talking about. One of them is to issue debt, right? So you borrow money to build a building or renovate a building. There's a recurring referenda, which is a permanent increase to your budget, and then there is, and obviously for the borrowing referenda is to, that's you're increasing property taxes by however much you need to make that debt payment until you don't have that debt payment. And then there's also something called a non-recurring referendum, which has been growing, and that you're seeing more of those. And those are, it's like a recurring it's to increase your operating budget, but it's for a period of time. So, 4 years or 5 years or something like that. You say to the voters, we want to, increase your property taxes by this amount but not forever. Now what happens, sometimes that is done, that you could fund a renovation that way, and it really is sort of a limited term thing. In other cases, when that time period is up, we're also seeing that sometimes districts come back and say, you know what, we need to do that again. And the money that comes from those referendum is deposited in different funds or at the school district level or different pockets. But I don't think that's what you're asking me. I think you're asking me you're saying when a district chooses to increase the amount of money it's spending, that can increase its state aid. Not, again, you're doing your shared cost lags a year, so not immediately, but it can increase your state aid. And I think what you're asking is, where does that increase come from? Is that correct?
We borrowed $70 million.
Right. Okay.
Let's just get down to numbers here. Of that amount, it was my understanding, and I was talked to several people, that there's only about $25 million of that was actually going to impact the taxpayers in Beloit.
Right.
And of that, $13 million was going to come from the businesses and $12 from the standard, homeowners.
Right. Or whatever your property tax.
The other $45 million is what I'm questioning.
Yeah. Where does that come from?
Yes.
Well, it comes from the state. It's not a situation where someone at the state level, like a lawmaker, says, guys, you're never going to believe it, Beloit needs $70 million, or Beloit has this, so we got to come up with another $50 million. It's not like that. There's a pot of money, and part of the general aid formula is how much money is getting plugged in by the people that are elected by you and everybody else to go to the state capitol and decide that. And so no, it's a, but as, it's a situation where overall, the formula adjusts to, as certain districts spend more, certain districts spend less, to apportion that amount. So does that answer the question?
So it's basically state-funded money?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
The term you're looking for is shared costs. It's part of our
Yeah.
shared costs
Right.
in the district, and then our state aid, we are aided on our shared costs. So what we
Right.
pay that $2 million a year or whatever the debt payment is, that's shared cost, and the state aids us, whatever that is, 60%, 70%, whatever the formula happens to be that year.
Right. Right.
But I'm wondering, is that money that Beloit got back, the 65%, is it coming from other districts? Because it has to come from somewhere. So are other districts getting less?
Yeah. Potentially, yes. Yeah. Right.
Okay. And there's no control over how much your referendum is.
Well, there is. It's the voters.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
But beyond that, no.
I mean,
no.
So it could really affect other districts if you pass the referendum, for 200.
There's some time, place, and manner restrictions that the legislature puts, and they've, in recent years, they have put some additional restrictions on when and how referenda can be held, and they've considered doing even more. So, the state has some ability to restrict referenda, but no, it's the voters that are deciding that.
It doesn't come from other districts, though. Where it comes from the state, is from things like the gas tax, things like the income tax.
Sales and income tax, right.
Things like bonded debt by the state to cover their costs, which they continue to do because the legislature can bond almost illimitably. And so the state underwriting those costs doesn't really affect other districts.
Sure. So, and
Except
maybe
for
I should
year.
rephrase what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it comes from the general fund taxes that the state collects. So it's sales and income and all those things. What I'm saying is there's a certain amount of money that the state puts into general aid, that, you know, every budget that they decide to do that, and then the formula apportions that. And so, you know, the shared costs that exist have a, you know, and all the districts together have an impact on how that, you know, and district by district have an impact on how that formula works, you know. But what I'm saying, it's not a situation where because Beloit does this, you know, somebody says, oh, we got to put another half penny on the sales tax, you know, and then put that money into the school formula. It's not like that.
Well, getting back to what John just said, though, we're counting on that 65% from the state. So, Dr. Childs, I hear you saying the state underwrites it through a bond. My concern is if there's a ton of referendums and they're all getting reimbursed at this high level, is there a chance that we could ever lose our 65%?
No. The state bonds independently, they're not subsidizing our bond. Our bonds are our bonds, but the state does its own bonding. And from their own bonding, they do things like fix the roads and underwrite, you know, what needs to be underwritten for school districts, for their general aids and for their other categorical aids and the other things that they do, because the state typically does not collect enough revenue in any given year, as I understand it at least, to meet all of the commitments and obligations and expenses that they incur. So about every biennial budget they bond a certain amount, but then every biennial budget there's also another certain amount of bonded debt that's retiring. So
yeah,
you know, there may or may not be a positive balance at the end of that time, but they don't actually subsidize our bond.
Yeah, so that's all basically right. One thing that the state does not do is the state is forbidden by its constitution, in theory at least, from borrowing to pay operating expenses. So we can borrow money to you know, build roads, you know, do all sorts of capital, you know, build a dormitory, things like that, you know, at UW, that sort of thing. Aid to schools would be an operating expense that would come out, would need to come out of, you know, taxes or fees or federal aid, that sort of thing.
But you need to understand that in order to accommodate that constitutional caveat, what the state does is just fudge things around so that they move their tax draws, their income, their receipts in over here, and then bond where they've left the hole.
Yeah, where that sort of thing happens is that the state budgets on a cash basis. So, you know, if you were running a Fortune 500 company, you would budget using something called accrual accounting, which, you know, basically means that you would recognize the expenses that you have in the moment that you incur them, and you can't take them back. You know, it's kind of like if you buy some clothes, you know, at Penny's with your credit card, and you can't take them back, let's say. I mean, Penny's will let you take them back, but let's just say tough times are tough out there. They're not going to let you do it anymore. Then at that point, you know, you would, as a company, you would recognize that expense. What the state doesn't actually recognize it until they pay the bill. So and one thing that you will see that is like a form of borrowing is that certain things that the state pays, like the school levy tax credit, they will approve that spending in one budget, but they will not actually pay out the money until the next budget. And so that is like a form of borrowing, because they're saying to you guys, and the school levy tax credit is not exactly for schools, it's more just something that buys down the overall property taxes that sort of all local governments are contributing to. But anyway, don't worry about that. The point is that they're sort of saying to the locals, hey, don't worry, we've got you on this. there's going to be $500 million in the school levy tax credit. But some of that money, let's say $200 million, doesn't get actually paid until the next budget, even though once they've made that commitment, they can't walk away from it. So it's, in a sense, you're sort of floating that for them, in a sense.
Well, and that creates an environment where there's almost a necessity for a school district to carry a balance, a fund balance over year to year, simply because the way the state distributes state aids doesn't match up with what districts have to pay out over
when
that
they
block
have
of
to,
time.
right.
And so there are many districts who have expended and drawn down their fund balances and consequently are caught into short-term borrowing, which means that money that could have been diverted into the classroom for kids or for other educational purposes now has to be diverted into paying off interest and short-term borrowing.
Right. And then you see some states that are really in a fiscal fix, like Illinois, and then that can become really, a real issue in terms of a cash flow issue for the state. That can flow downhill to the local government.
Thank you. That's why I'm in Wisconsin.
Back to John and Jeff's question, though, the 65% is not set in stone. What you're getting on that is what is your state aid percentage each year as you make that debt payment.
Right.
So 1 year you might have been 70% state aided, and then the next year you're at 67. So it's not that it's always at 65%, but the state, as long as you're making that debt payment, it's part of your shared cost, and you're getting state aid on that money. But there's nothing that says something couldn't happen here that our enrollment keeps declining and our aid drops to 59%. Then you're only going to get 59% of aid that year. So there is no set number for debt. They don't treat debt any differently than any other expense in the school. It all just goes into the formula. And whatever comes out in the end is what you get.
Okay, now I'm confused. I thought the percentage had to do with where you were at in the property value thing, not
It
how many
does.
kids.
Well, it has to do with so many things, but that is one. Again, just think about it. Each one of these things is like an input that you put into the computer, and I don't miss your name, but the gentleman's exactly correct. That Bob is exactly correct. That one input is the property value, and one input is what is the shared cost, and another input is what is the number of students, and another input, other inputs is how much the state is willing to spend on general aids, and and then that all the other districts and their inputs, and that all is and what is happening with property values statewide, and all that gets put into the computer, and then it spits out what an answer is, and it can be unpredictable. I mean, for instance, when the state budget is done, a lot of times the lawmakers want to know, what are we doing? They all want to know, what am I doing to my district? And the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which is like our CBO, will run the numbers when they have a budget proposal and be like, well, using last year's numbers, here's what would happen to your district. But when you see that, it gives sometimes, I think, people a false sense of security that they know what's going to happen with their district. They don't really know, because until you get those numbers and who's showing up for school and all those things, the current numbers, it changes, and sometimes in ways that are unexpected. I can remember when Joint Finance, the Budget Committee, was headed by two lawmakers from Madison. They put forward a budget proposal, and it turned out to be really not great for the Madison School District in terms of their budget and their overall finances. Well, was that what they intended to do? No, it was definitely not what they intended to do, and they did, I think, change it. But again, it can be, even for well-advised professional people, it can be sometimes there are surprises with how, because it's all so complex.
It is. Any other questions? Okay, Mr. Stein, thank you. We really appreciate this presentation. It was timely, since we have to address the budget real soon. and very informative.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you so much.
best of luck with that.
Thank you. Good night. And we're adjourned.